Hi, I'm Alice König, a senior lecturer at the University of St Andrews and a member of the Young Academy of Scotland's Responsible Debate Project. Like the rest of the team, I'm interested in how we can find better ways to discuss and disagree with each other so that we can make progress on important topics rather than speaking past each other and competing to win the debate.
Hi, I'm Ken Mavor. I'm a senior lecturer at St Andrews in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience. I'm a social psychologist by background and very interested in these issues of how we have productive debate.
And we're going to focus on the question of how our identities affect the ways in which we debate. And in particular, I want to ask Ken to help us understand what challenges different aspects of our identity might pose for responsible debate, and also how we can avoid these problems if we're trying to debate responsibly. When we think about our sense of identity, how much of that is personal and how much of our identity is socially formed?
Although we're very obviously social animals, many traditions emphasize the individual self as the ultimate reference point. And socialization is something that is done to a person to help them fit in. In social psychology, the very definition of our discipline is the perspective that the social aspects of ourselves are central to who we are, not just window dressing to our individual self. So to ask then how much of ourselves are socially formed is perhaps slightly misleading, because the answer is, in one sense, is 100%, because even our individual selves are constructed in interaction with other individuals as members of many categories and groups. So everything in this sense is social. A better way to think of it is how we are able to manage to present ourselves to the world in ways that draw upon our individuality and also our social memberships and connections in the right contexts. Sometimes we want to mainly present our individual selves. Sometimes we want to demonstrate our connections to the social world in order to give us a sense of belonging. So interestingly, in some perspectives, specific categories and groups have become amplified in importance to the extent that they overrule our individuality, even when we don't want them to. A lot of current social tensions can arise from the idea of misrecognition, where the self I want to present to the world does not align with how the world sees me in that moment.
So can you tell us a little bit more about how our social ties, our social relations with each other, and our social identities actually help to shape, not just reflect, our viewpoints?
So as social beings, we inevitably are shaped by our social connections and our social selves. Some people see this as primarily influenced from the outside. So we often talk about like peer pressure, which kind of implies that external pressure on us in some way, the true us. But actually, generally, however, we actually form our social self over time. We incorporate what's important to the group as also important for us. So particularly, we might say when those collective selves are activated, right? That's when we tend to bring those things into our own sense of who we are. So what we mean by activated is that in particular settings, or perhaps by particular topics, or the physical presence of other in-group or out-group members, these things might make us more aware of our social self than our personal self. So, for example, at a sporting match, we're much more aware of our shared enjoyment of the sport and our shared enthusiasm for a particular team, and are more likely to act collectively in expressing that aspect of our identity. When a particular social identity is activated, and more so if that identity is really important to us, then we may feel that we want to represent the group's interests and perspectives as we interact with others in that context. It's not that suddenly we have a new viewpoint because the social self is already part of us, but rather that the viewpoint that captures the importance of that identity to us is the one that matters most in that moment.
So that makes me want to know a bit more about how our sense of identity then really affects how we discuss and debate particularly controversial issues.
Yeah, specific topics and situations can be very potent in emphasizing certain aspects of our social selves. In many cases, I believe there can be alignment between multiple ways of thinking about the self. For example, an individual might see themselves as someone for whom justice and fairness are very important personal values. How these values are expressed, however, is also shaped by our group memberships and social alignments, so that we might feel particularly strongly when a particular categorization or group membership amplifies a sense of injustice. So when particular topics come up, we can find ourselves moving between interacting as individuals and interacting as members of these valued social groups. And we perhaps want those multiple identities to be recognized and respected in that interaction. So on the flip side, the fact that our own social identities are being activated also means that we will be more likely to perceive those we are speaking to, not just as individuals, but also members of particular categories. In particular, if we disagree with them, it might make more sense to us that they're acting like members of some outgroup to me, and we may treat them in a way that emphasizes their membership of those other categories. That, though, may feel itself like a misrecognition to them. So these mutual misrecognitions may undermine the capacity to have a helpful discussion if one sees the goal of the discussion as coming to some common understanding.
You're saying that we might be more inclined to agree with people we identify with than with people we don't. Can you explain a bit more why that is, and also what impact that can then have on how we debate differences of opinion?
This is an interesting question because it potentially runs both ways. We are more inclined to agree with people we identify with, but we're also more inclined to identify with people we agree with. So both of these processes are part of the evolving nature of social categories. We forget this when we assume that the only categories that matter are fixed physical categories. But I would argue that most of the categories we move in and out of over any given day are not those broad physical categories, but more involve things like shared roles, shared beliefs, shared skills, shared goals, and so on. Our social lives naturally evolve in ways that lead us into various useful clusters based around something shared. And so because of that, we might reasonably assume that the clusters we're in also share other things. So our default position then might be to assume we agree with people in our categorical clusters unless we discover otherwise. When we think about differences of opinion, we should remember that we often, and I would argue actually most of the time, value such differences and seek them out when we're unsure about something ourselves. We, at least in the abstract, want feedback from our teachers, for example, so we get better at what we value. We seek advice from specialists when we need work done on our houses or with medical concerns. We seek views from friends over how to deal with the latest relationship crisis, or whether we'll take on that new task or new job. So we want other opinions, even if they differ from ours. However, this generally works because even if we differ on some dimensions from others, we also share other common understandings. I believe it becomes more difficult as we start to feel that we share less and less with the person with an opposing opinion. The more they seem to be an outsider on multiple dimensions, the more I may take their divergent opinion as reinforcing of my own identity as different to them. That changes the dynamic of the conversation because instead of finding useful new opinions, it becomes more about confirming our opposing social categories. So those who, for example, study opinion polarization are particularly interested in this kind of dynamic.
Can you tell us a little bit more, Ken, about the ways in which our social identities then do divide us?
We often ask the question in this way because we're usually concerned about the amount of conflict and distress in the world around us. And I believe it's important to remember that much of the time, actually our social identities unite us. That's why they're important to us. They enable us to be part of a collective, more powerful, more agentic than we can be on our own, and give us multiple ways in which we can feel a sense of belonging and connection to others. But it's possible for us to frame the world, unfortunately, in ways that emphasize the divisions between identities. I believe this is in some ways a political choice and in some ways a personal choice. Some people, for political reasons, choose to make visible and emphasize the differences between various collective identities in order to fragment a larger collective. In its most classic form, this is divide and conquer. Right? But particular voting systems, for example, tend to favour collective identities that have particular spatial or demographic qualities. Political expediency might play on those factors as well. Another dimension, though, is that sometimes we make personal choices that lead to social division. So while our individual life histories are no doubt also affected by our social identities, Some approaches to social conflict emphasize a narrative of victimhood around these histories that can intensify conflict rather than redress it. To make everything about our social identities is just as problematic as not recognizing those social identities at all. So as I see it, finding a balance between recognizing social inequalities but also finding a place for individual agency is a balance we need to find in order to be able to make positive change.
Do you think that our sense of identity has more influence over how we debate these topics in person or online? What difference has the digital revolution made to people's sense of identity and how that influences their modes of debating?
Yeah, many commentators have noted that social media and our online lives can make these tensions worse and increase social conflict and polarization. And I think there's several common reasons to think that. So one, generally speaking, it's harder to be nasty and aggressive to someone face to face than when they're anonymous or distant. So we lose some of that natural hesitation when we're in the online context. Also, the people we are likely to meet in most physical spaces, like towns or organizations or our schools and our classrooms, will have a mixture of overlapping social identities, some shared, some different. So there's more common ground, and it's harder to see people as inevitably different to us. Whereas we can find online spaces where people just share one thing in common and only interact around that one thing. We don't have to deal with their real complexity. And so it seems that they have more in common with us than they really do, or alternatively, that they're completely opposed to us on that one dimension. And so it's easier to end up sharing more or more extreme views without anything to balance those views. So the digital world is not the only way and this can happen, but it is easier for that to happen without us noticing so much.
What can we do when we're debating with each other to get past the biases and the barriers that our social identities can bring along, and perhaps to lean into the advantages that our social identities offer in responsible debate?
Some would argue that we have to ignore our social identities, right, and try and just treat everyone as an individual. But that only works because of the often unspoken assumption that we rely upon our common humanity as our shared social identity. So even when we're making that focus on just treating everybody as an individual, that's actually not what's really going on, right? There's really this kind of common shared humanity that's assumed to be what brings us together. But sometimes that does work. However, there are other times when it's not going to work so well, and particularly if there are meaningful social identities that underlie the issue at hand or are triggered by our apparent differences, then ignoring them just makes it harder to manage any biased assumptions or misrecognitions that we have for each other. When I was a young person, I spent some time growing up in the USA, and there was a sort of a Native American saying that I learnt in school, which was not to criticize someone till you have walked a mile in their moccasins. And this was suggestive of our human capacity for what we call theory of mind, our capacity to try and understand how another person sees the world. We don't have this when we're born. We only learn to do it when we're about 4 or 5 years old. And as far as we know, we are the only species on Earth that really has this capacity to at least try and understand the perspective of others. It's, if you like, one of our superpowers. And so rather than trying to ignore the social identities, what we can try and do is remember several things. That our ideas and arguments are shaped by our identities, and the people we're debating with have also been shaped by theirs. We will understand each other better if we try and step into their shoes for a moment and use our special human skill of theory of mind to try and see the other side. If they see us making that effort, they may be inclined to do the same for us, right? And to try and understand our perspective at the same time. So at the very least, this might reduce our tendency to misrecognize each other and have a better conversation. There are other good thinking strategies that we can engage in, like fact-checking and avoiding double standards in our thinking. We can try and use these strategies to work out the best answer to the debate. But if we start with acknowledging each other, then then using these strategies becomes a collective goal. Because what's the opposite of this? If the sides polarize and see each other as enemies and inherently wrong, then even if one side tries to use good thinking strategies in the discussion and the debate, the other side may actually declare good thinking itself as wrong. Right. And that makes the whole thing impossible. So sadly, we do see that dynamic in a number of social conflicts when just good debate becomes actually tagged as something that only the outgroup does. I mean, and so that's seen as wrong. In the end, how can we make social identities a strength rather than seeing them as problems to be avoided? I would say that it's generally better to acknowledge differences in identities rather than just try and avoid them, but also to look for identities in common. We have many more identities than just the handful we often get stuck on. And so we can also look for other things that we share. I believe that when we take the right approach to debate and dialogue, then both the things we share in common and also the identities on which we differ can both be seen as avenues to better understanding.